Picture the usual image first, because you already have one. A hunched brute in a fur loincloth, dragging a club, grunting at a woolly mammoth. Now ask a much more boring question. On an ordinary Tuesday, 40 years before nobody, what actually had the best odds of killing this person? Not the mammoth. The mammoth is the least of it. The window we are talking about runs from roughly 400,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago, across Europe and Western Asia, inside the cold belt that clung to the edge of the ice sheets. Not Africa, not deserts, river valleys, oak and pine forests, and open steppe crawling with animals built for cold. Population estimates put the entire species at any one time somewhere in the low tens of thousands, spread across a continent. For comparison, that is fewer people than attend a single mid-size football match today, scattered over an area larger than the whole of the United States east of the Mississippi. You could walk for a week and see no one. Loneliness wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the default setting. So why build a body and a life around a place this empty and this cold? Because the alternative was extinction by exposure, and biology had already answered the question before culture caught up. A short, barrel-chested frame retains heat better than a tall, lean one. The same reason a mug of tea cools faster than a thermos. A wide nose warms and moistens frozen air before it reaches the lungs. None of this was elegant. It worked, which in an ice age is the only design spec that matters. Start the day then the way it actually started. Cold, dim, smelling of smoke and hide. The hearth mattered more than anything else in the shelter, because a fire that dies overnight in a glacial valley is not an inconvenience. It's a death sentence deferred by a few hours. Sites like the ones excavated at Layers in France and the Levant show repeated, maintained hearths, not campfires lit once and abandoned, but the same spot used over and over, meaning someone was tasked effectively with fire management as a full-time job. Call it the Paleolithic equivalent of a building superintendent, unglamorous, unpaid, and if he slacks off, everyone freezes. Water came next, and this is where the day gets more dangerous than the movies suggest. Most water sources near a shelter were also visited by cave bears, cave hyenas, and leopards, which is a genuinely bad commute. Isotope studies on bone collagen, the kind of chemistry that lets researchers reconstruct diet from what's essentially fossilized nutrition labels, show a diet extremely heavy in meat, on the level of modern Arctic wolves. That's not a lifestyle brand. It's a landscape with almost nothing else on a calorie menu for 8 months of the year. Getting that meat is where the injury statistics come in, and they are the part of the story that quietly demolishes the club and grunt image. Paleopathologist Erik Trinkaus compared the pattern of healed fractures on Neanderthal skeletons, collarbones, skulls, upper arms, to a database of modern occupational injuries, and the closest match wasn't soldiers, it was rodeo riders. People who get regularly, repeatedly slammed by something enormous and unhappy about the situation. The likely explanation is close-range hunting. No bows, no reliable throwing spears with the aerodynamics for real distance. So the plan was to get near a bison or a red deer and stab it with a heavy, straight-thrusting spear. Get near is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Getting near a bison is not a strategy so much as a controlled collision. And yet, the body that took that beating for decades wasn't disposable. The skeleton found at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, catalogued as Shanidar I, belonged to a man in late middle age, by the standards of his world, elderly, with a withered right arm, likely blind in one eye, missing most of his teeth, and showing healed damage that would have left him unable to hunt, or maybe even grip a spear properly for years before he died. He survived anyway, which means somebody fed him for years with nothing to gain from it in return. The 19th century description of a separate skeleton, the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints, spent decades as the anatomical basis for the stooped, ape-like posture in every textbook drawing, until later researchers noticed the original specimen had severe arthritis and had simply been an old, sick individual, not a representative Neanderthal. In other words, the entire hunched brute silhouette in your head is traceable, in large part, to one arthritic skeleton and one overeager illustrator in 1908. The meat-heavy picture isn't the whole plate either, and this is one of the places where brute has quietly done a lot of misleading work. Dental calculus, the fossilized plaque still clinging to ancient teeth, has been analyzed for microscopic starch grains, and Neanderthal sites in what is now Iraq and Belgium turned up residue from wild grains, roots, and legumes, some of it showing the damage pattern you get specifically from cooking, not chewing raw. That means someone was boiling or roasting plant food deliberately, adjusting a diet around whatever the season actually offered, rather than eating meat because meat was some kind of ideological commitment. On the coasts of what is now Portugal and Spain, other sites show shellfish middens, piles of discarded mussel and clamshells, meaning low tide was also foraging time, the Ice Age equivalent of stopping by the market on the way home because the hunt came back empty-handed. None of this happened in isolation, and neither did learning it. A hand axe or a hafted spear is not intuitive. Nobody wakes up already knowing how to knap a stone core into a symmetrical blade, or judge exactly how long to smoke birch bark before it turns from useless sap into usable glue. Wear patterns and refitted stone flakes at long-occupied sites suggest knapping happened in the same spots repeatedly, generation after generation, which is about as close to an apprenticeship system as the archaeological record can show without a written contract. The apprentice was probably younger, standing closer than felt strictly comfortable, being corrected by someone older, holding the same tool 1,000 times before. Trial and error, except the errors were sharp. Tools filled the hours between hunts, and here the myth takes another hit. Neanderthals produced hafted composite tools, a stone point lashed to a wooden shaft using birch bark tar, a glue that requires heating bark in an oxygen-starved environment to a fairly narrow temperature range. Get it wrong, and you get charcoal, not adhesive. Reproducing this process in modern experimental archaeology takes practice and planning. It is not something you back into by accident while banging rocks together. Chemistry with a margin for error measured in degrees, done without a thermometer, over an open fire, in a cave. Call it Bronze Age chemistry, running about 100,000 years ahead of the Bronze Age. Sleep, when it came, wasn't the 8 uninterrupted hours a modern body assumes it's owed. Shelters were shared with the fire, with the smell of drying hide, and with whoever was on watch, because hyenas denning nearby is a documented hazard at several sites, not a screenwriter's invention. Rest happened in shifts around a threat schedule, the way a small night shift crew might structure sleep around a machine that can't be left unattended. Except the machine, in this case, was a cave entrance, and the alternative to attending it was losing someone before morning. Clothing was the next line of defense, though it likely wasn't sewn the way later Ice Age peoples sewed. No eyed needles have turned up at Neanderthal sites, only hide scrapers in large numbers. So think wrapped and draped hides rather than a tailored parka, which is a real difference in how much cold actually gets in around the neck and wrists. It's the difference between a proper winter coat and a heavy blanket held shut with your hands. Survivable, but you notice the gap every single day. Somewhere in the same routine, there's the matter of what these people did with each other and with the dead. And this is exactly where the record gets genuinely disputed, so it's worth saying plainly. disputed. Pollen found in the soil around a burial at Shanidar was originally read as evidence of flowers deliberately placed on a grave, a strikingly tender detail that made international headlines. Later analysis suggested the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents that store seeds underground, which is a far less poetic but entirely plausible contamination. The field has not settled this one way or the other. Some burials at other sites do look intentional, bodies in shallow pits in flexed positions without obvious scavenger damage, which, at minimum, argues for corpse disposal as a practiced behavior, whatever the emotional content behind it. Attributing full funerary ritual to it is a claim still being argued over in the journals, not a settled fact you get to put on a t-shirt. The bigger question: what eventually ended this way of life, sometime around 40,000 years ago, gets the same disputed flag, because the honest answer is that it probably wasn't one thing. Climate swung hard and fast during this period, and a small, spread-out population is exactly the kind of population that a string of bad decades can quietly erase without anyone needing to do anything violent at all. Modern humans expanding into the same territory around the same time is also part of the story. And there, the popular version jumps straight to war and slaughter, a tidy, cinematic explanation with almost no direct physical evidence behind it. Some researchers have floated conflict, or even something like systematic violence. It remains a minority, contested position, not a documented event with a body count. The version with the most support from the genetic and archaeological record looks less dramatic and more familiar. Competition for the same limited resources, occasional and probably rare interbreeding, and populations already thin enough that a run of hard winters could tip the balance permanently. That interbreeding detail is where the story stops being about them and starts being about you, specifically. Genome sequencing led by Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute, published in Science in 2010, then refined by K. Proofer and colleagues in Nature, established that Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern humans outside Africa interbred more than once. The result? People of non-African ancestry today carry, on average, around 2% Neanderthal DNA. Not 2% of your personality, not 2% of your face, 2% of your genome, scattered across specific stretches of specific chromosomes, silently doing specific jobs. David Reich's lab has spent years mapping exactly which stretches survived and which got weeded out over generations, the way you'd audit which parts of an inherited toolkit still get used and which rusted into uselessness. This is a fact about ancestry and inheritance, not a hierarchy. The 2% figure describes shared history in certain populations, and it says nothing whatsoever about intelligence, worth, or race, despite what a century of bad science tried to make of the word Neanderthal as an insult. Some of what got kept is oddly specific. Work by Carlos Lalueza-Fox on ancient DNA found variants of the pigmentation gene linked to red hair and pale skin in at least some Neanderthal individuals, a separate mutation from the one that does the same job in modern humans, evolution solving an identical cold climate lighting problem twice, with two different tools. And in 2020, Hugo Zeeberg and Svante Pääbo, publishing again, traced a Neanderthal-derived stretch of chromosome 3 to a measurably higher risk of severe illness during the COVID-19 pandemic. The same immune system variants that once may have helped fight off Ice Age pathogens, turning into a liability against a virus that didn't exist for the other 399,900 and something years of the relevant window. Meanwhile, a completely different inherited variant appears linked to a slightly higher pain threshold. So, depending on which 2% you happen to draw, The inheritance sitting quietly in your DNA right now is either working against you in a hospital ward or making a dentist's visit marginally more tolerable. Nobody hands you a printout explaining which one you got, which puts the original image back on the table, upgraded. Not a grunting brute failing to invent the wheel, but a short, immensely strong, chronically injured adult who kept a fire alive through an Arctic night, cooked bark into glue at exactly the right temperature with no thermometer, carried an old blind man through winters that owed him nothing, and occasionally lost the argument with a bison. The club and the loincloth were never the point. The point was a body engineered by 100,000 generations of bad weather, and a piece of that engineering is sitting in your genome right now, deciding, quietly and without asking permission, how your immune system reacts to a virus that showed up several 100,000 years after the last hearth went cold.